Okay, so let's continue on with the female, all right? And we're going to talk about the ovaries first, okay? So let's talk about ovary anatomy, and then we'll look at ovary histology and those follicles forming, and then the ovarian cycle. Okay. So, anatomy first, all right? So, the ovary, its function is to produce the ovum, the egg. It is stabilized in place, all right? So, this is our ovary. It's stabilized in place, anchored in place by a series of ligaments. So, our first one is this suspensory ligament up here, okay? The suspensory ligament is going to anchor the ovary to the lateral abdominal wall. Okay, and you can kind of tell by its location, it's going to go out on either side from either ovary towards the lateral abdominal wall and anchor it in place that way. And then we have our ovarian ligament, which is here. All right, and so that ovarian ligament is going to connect the ovary medially to the uterus. And then lastly, we have the broad ligament. So the broad ligament is a fold of the peritoneum. Okay, and it's going to connect to the uterus, right? So it is actually, let me just kind of do this, right? So it's this sheet we see here and under here. All of that is broad ligament. So it actually connects our fallopian tubes here with the uterus and the ovary. So it connects those three structures. All right, so we'll just say it connects the uterus, ovary, and the fallopian tube. Okay, and so I'll just point to this here, but it includes that entire sheet of connective tissue. Okay, so that is our kind of anatomy part, all right? And so now let's talk histology. So with the histology, we'll go through the different follicles involved in the maturation of that egg, that ovum. Okay, so first of all, let's just define what a follicle is first. And so referring to specifically in the ovaries, a follicle in the ovaries, I know we've had follicles with other things like the thyroid gland and whatnot, but in the ovaries, a follicle refers to the egg and we'll just say and its surrounding follicular cells. All right, and so sometimes these cells are referred to as granulosa cells. Okay, all right, so that's what a follicle is. Okay, and so we start with our least developed form of the follicle. Remember we said that was our our primordial follicle. So the primordial follicle, remember it is arrested, waiting, paused in prophase 1. All right. Paused in prophase 1. Remember they are present at birth. All the primordial follicles you're going to have are present at birth. Okay, and so they're located along the outer edge, the cortex of the ovary. So if you're looking at a slide of the ovary, if you look at the outer edge out here, that's where you're going to see all of those primordial follicles. So that's what they're showing in this picture with all these little guys here. Those are all primordial follicles. And so they are, so it's an egg with squamous cells around it, right? So those cells, those follicular cells, are going to be simple squamous. All right, so that's our primordial follicle. And so then once that primordial follicle gets a signal, the hormone signal, we'll talk about in a little bit with our ovarian cycle, once it gets its appropriate hormone signal, it's going to start developing into a primary follicle. All right, and so a primary follicle is going to be the ovum and one layer of cells, and they usually look kind of like simple cuboidal. All right, so one layer of, we'll just call them granulosa cells. Why do we keep doing this? Stop that. All right, so granulosa cells. Okay, so this primary follicle it contains that ovum, which is a primary oocyte. So that cell is still in meiosis 1. Okay, so we have our primordial follicle contains a primary oocyte. Our primary follicle still contains a primary oocyte. Okay, and so then from there, it's going to develop into a secondary follicle. All right, so the secondary follicle contains a still primary oocyte. Okay, and that primary oocyte is surrounded by a few layers of those granulosa cells. Right, so layers of granulosa cells, and an antrum, so a kind of space, starts to form. Okay, so if we were going to point on this picture, right, we have our primordial follicles out here. This would be a primary follicle, and then we'd reach secondary here and here. These would both be secondary follicles. Okay, and so then from the secondary follicle, we're going to develop into a Graafian follicle. And so this would be our Graafian follicle here. All right, and so a Graafian follicle now contains a secondary oocyte. All right, so this is now our haploid cell that is entering meiosis 2. So it contains a secondary oocyte. All right, and you can tell you're looking at a Graafian follicle because it's going to have this big space in the middle. That's called the antrum. All right, and then you have your oocyte, your secondary oocyte, surrounded by this layer of cells called the corona radiata. Right, that's just radiating crown, this crown around that ovum, that oocyte. And then you have the ovum in the middle. Okay, so that's the Graafian follicle. And so then from there, we're going to go to ovulation. So once that Graafian follicle has developed, there will be a hormone signal that stimulates ovulation. Okay, and so that hormone signal we're going to talk about in a second is the surge of the hormone luteinizing hormone, which we talked about before, right? So there is an LH surge. Okay, that is the signal for ovulation. There's an LH surge, and then the ovum and its corona radiata. They actually move through the outer layer of cuboidal cells on the ovary, through the wall of the ovary into the peritoneal cavity. All right, so we'll say move through the wall of the ovary. Okay, so we'll look in a minute where it's going to go from there when we talk about fallopian tubes. Okay, but we're still in the ovary, and so what's left in the ovary after ovulation? So this ovum and the corona radiata leave, but now we have this big thick layer of all of these granulosa cells left behind. So what's going to happen is this is going to kind of shrivel up, right, and collapse in on itself and become this structure, okay, and this structure. That is called the corpus luteum. So the corpus luteum is made up of those granulosa cells left over after ovulation, all right, and its job is to produce the hormone progesterone, all right? So after ovulation, and it is going to produce progesterone. Okay. All right, and so that leads us into the ovarian cycle. So I want to talk about the ovarian cycle, and then we're going to leave at that point and then pick up where we left off on our next lecture. So the ovarian cycle. All right, so there are two cycles for the female reproductive system. You have the ovarian cycle, we're going to look at now, and then you have the uterine cycle, which we'll look at next time. All right, and so obviously they're named based on where they occur, the ovary versus the uterus. So the ovarian cycle involves the development of these follicles, and then ovulation, and then what happens with that corpus luteum after ovulation. Then the uterine cycle would involve the thickening of the uterine wall, and then the kind of release of the uterine wall, the shedding of the uterine wall through menstruation. So they are separate, but they are linked to each other because they share hormone signals, okay? So hormone signals, a lot of them are shared between the two, and they occur in response to similar signals. Okay, and estrogen produced by these follicles is going to be involved in controlling that uterine cycle as well. Okay, so they're linked, but we're going to talk about them separately so it doesn't get too confusing. Okay, so the ovarian cycle is 28 days long. All right, so you can see down here, so we go from day 1 to day 28. So it's 28 days long. All right. We'll just add that up here. So 28 days long. Okay, and it functions through a series of kind of choreographed, coordinated positive and negative feedback. Okay, so it's divided into 3 major events. Okay, the first one is the follicular phase, and so the follicular phase is going to be from day 1 to day 14. That is going to be the follicular phase. My pencil is wigging out for a second. Hold on. Let me see if I can fix it. Sometimes it just gets tired of behaving properly. Okay, see if that helps. All right, so from day 1 to 14, that's going to be the follicular phase. All right, the follicular phase is driven by the release of follicle stimulating hormone, FSH. And so if you remember from way back at the beginning of the semester, FSH comes from the anterior pituitary. All right, it's one of our tropic hormones. So remember, the hypothalamus sends out a releasing hormone that triggers the anterior pituitary to secrete FSH. FSH is a tropic hormone, which means it acts on another gland, causing it to secrete its own hormone. Okay, so FSH is driving this ovarian cycle. All right, so it's controlled by FSH. And so the signal, FSH signal, causes the follicles to develop, right? So we'll say causes follicle. Wow, we are not happy. Okay. To develop. Okay, and so as that follicle develops and gets larger, we go from primordial to primary to secondary, those follicles are going to start secreting estrogen. All right, so estrogen is made by the follicular cells. Okay, so that estrogen is being made by those follicular cells. So follicle stimulating hormone is stimulating those follicles to start to develop. And then if you remember, right, as our follicles develop, we go from these little primordial guys that have like just simple squamous around them to primary, which has, you know, larger cells, granulosa cells, to secondary, which has layers of granulosa cells. All right, so we're adding more and more of these follicular cells that make estrogen as the follicle develops. Okay, so with this process, there is a negative feedback loop. All right, negative feedback. So let's talk about that as kind of a refresher. So if you remember, with our kind of hypothalamic hypophyseal axis, the way that it works is that the hypothalamus, if you remember kind of these little charts we did, right, with the arrows, the hypothalamus sends out its, hypothalamus sends out its releasing hormone that causes the anterior pituitary to make FSH. FSH will go to the ovary, causing the follicles to develop and release estrogen. That estrogen will feed back onto the hypothalamus, all right? And then if there's an elevated level of estrogen, that'll reduce the amount of releasing hormone coming from the hypothalamus, so negative feedback. And so that's why, right, the FSH levels here, they stay pretty constant for the most part, right, because of that negative feedback. So you want kind of just a baseline level of FSH. That's negative feedback. Okay. So then something special happens on day 14. So around day 14 is when that Graafian follicle develops. All right, so we reach the stage of that Graafian follicle. So we have this big Graafian follicle with a ton of granulosa cells making a bunch of estrogen. And so what happens is the Graafian follicle releases a lot of estrogen, and that completely overwhelms that negative feedback loop we were just talking about. And so the response to that overwhelming that feedback loop is that there is a surge in luteinizing hormone. Okay, so that's day 14, and that's what we see here. We have this spike, this LH surge, and that's because this really large Graafian follicle is releasing so much estrogen that it overwhelms the negative feedback, and you get a surge in luteinizing hormone. Okay, so that's day 14, and what that causes is it stimulates ovulation. All right, so that LH surge stimulates ovulation. So let's just make a note, right? So the increase in estrogen causes an LH spike, right? And that leads to ovulation. And remember, with ovulation, the oocyte and corona radiata are released. All right, so oocyte and corona, interesting word to hear again, right? The corona radiata, we hear a lot of corona right now, are going to be released. And remember, this oocyte is paused in metaphase 2. Just a reminder from what we just talked about. Okay, so it's paused in metaphase 2 until it is fertilized, and then it will continue the latter steps of meiosis. Okay, and so then we'll pick up on what happens with that egg a little later. It's been ovulated. All right, but now we're going to talk about the luteal phase. So we're staying in the ovary because this is the ovarian cycle, and we're going to look at the luteal phase, which is after ovulation. All right, so day 15 to 28, we have that corpus luteum that is left, and it's going to be producing the hormone progesterone. And so that hormone progesterone is going to maintain the uterine lining. All right, so this maintains the uterine lining. All right, that's our progesterone. And so that'll be for about 2 weeks. All right, so day 15 to day 28. So that corpus luteum makes progesterone for about 2 weeks. After that, if the egg is not fertilized, and so we'll get to what happens if it is, if the egg is not fertilized, that corpus luteum becomes this structure, which is called the corpus albicans. It doesn't produce progesterone anymore, right? So if egg is not fertilized. Okay? And so when that corpus luteum stops making progesterone, which was maintaining the uterine lining, that uterine lining can now be shed. That would be menstruation. So the act of this corpus luteum no longer making progesterone triggers the shedding of that uterine lining, which is menstruation. So like I said, these cycles are linked, right, by different hormones, but they're occurring in different places. So we talk about them